Hello everyone. In this tutorial, we'll explore how to create this scene step by step. We'll start by examining the 3D model, then we'll delve into how the materials were crafted. Finally, we'll utilize mouse and state change events along with sound actions to make the scene interactive. Let's dive in. So let's start by exploring how the 3D model of the gauge has been made. It's primarily created using primitive shapes. For example, for the upper body, we mainly use the ellipse shape, which you can access from the toolbar menu. As you can see, for the outer body of the gauge, we've changed the ring size and adjusted the size of the hole in the ellipse. Then we duplicated it, reduced the ring size, and moved it a little bit higher. This is how the entire upper body model has been created. Now, regarding the gauge, the material on this is currently not visible. But if we turn off the mask, you can see we have a gradient from green to red. The lower part of the gauge is not visible, and you can achieve this by changing the angle of the ellipse in the shape properties. Next, we have the glass. I turned this off because if we turn it on, you can't see the inner part of the model. But again, this is also basically an ellipse. Then we have the arrow's head and the arrow. The arrowhead is created using an ellipse, while the arrow itself is just a basic box with slight adjustments. If you want to know how I did it, I can show it quickly here. Let's create a box from the toolbar menu and change its size. In the shape properties, let's reduce the corner radius to something like 3 and click Smooth and Edit. First, use the slide tool to create an edge in the middle of the box. Then go to vertex mode, select the upper vertices, and scale them down. This way you can easily create an arrow. You can also increase the subdivision if you want more definition. Next, we have the press button, which is just a simple box with beveled corners. It also has text on top, so nothing too fancy. Then we have another cube shape that acts as the container for the press button. Now, let's talk about the bolts and nuts. The nuts are basically made with a pentagon shape. If you click on the pentagon shape, you can see you can change the number of sides. You can extrude it without needing any holes because they're not visible in the scene. However, if you want to create a hole, you can convert it to a path and change the profile to a rectangle, adjusting the size as needed. Next, we have a bolt that is made with a circle shape. I used a cloner to distribute more of them. If I turn off the cloner, you can see it's just a simple circle with a hole in it. Next, we have the floor, which is just a simple rectangle. Basically, that's all we have in this scene. This model is very simple, and we use basic primitive shapes in Spline to achieve this. Now that we know how the model has been made, let's talk about the materials. Let's start exploring the materials by beginning with how the floor material has been made. The material for the floor is basically composed of 3 color layers, each with a different mask applied. As you can see, one of them is a wire texture, another is a dots texture, and the last one has a circuit-like texture. If you're wondering how you can create these textures, I've got you covered. Here on this website, which you can find the link to in the description, you can generate different types of textures. The UI is simple. Just change the settings to your liking and click Generate. Then simply download the texture. If you click the top left icon, you can see several other options to create textures. Also, check out the Displays Connect's website as well, where you can generate circuit images. Now that you know how to create your own textures, let's go back to Spline. If we turn off all of the layers, you'll see we have only a black texture. If we turn on the next layer, you can see the dots pattern on it. It's just the texture we uploaded and applied as a mask to a color layer. The next layer is the wire texture. Again, the principle is similar. Upload the texture, and this time use a gradient layer instead of a color layer. This is because if you saw the final animation, the gradient changes from green to red, starting from the center. The third layer is a color layer as well, where we uploaded the third mask. For the second state, we changed the colors to red and orange. And for the gradient, we adjusted the ramp to transition from green to red. After discussing the floor, let's look at the model itself. The upper body is made of 3 layers, one matcap layer, and we used a gradient to add a little more detail. If we turn off the gradient, you can see the effect applied to the model. We use the screen blending mode for it. The other parts of the upper body are made with the same material structure. Next, we have the glass material, which consists of a couple of matte caps, a glass layer, and a Fresnel layer. After that, we have the button, which again is just a simple color layer with a matte cap layer on top. The text layer also has just a color layer. Then we have the gauge. If I go to the second stage, you can see it has a gradient that transitions from green to red. We achieve this by using a depth layer. If we turn off the mask, you can see we just used the depth layer and added colors to the ramp to go from green to red. We then applied the mask to it. If we change the mask to a color layer, you'll see it's just a simple gradient with a polar type applied. For the first state, we extended it all the way to the end so it disappears. In the second state, we moved it all the way to the left side to reveal the gauges. Finally, we have the arrow, which consists of 2 layers, a color layer and a lighting layer. That wraps up the materials section. In the next section, we will discuss lighting and effects. For the lighting, we used a simple directional light with a slight greenish tint in the base state. In the second state, it shifts to a red light and the intensity increases. For the post-processing effects, there's just one effect we used, which is the bloom effect. By enabling the bloom effect, you can add more visual interest to your scene. Lastly, we turned on the ambient shadow to add more realism to the scene. Now that we've discussed modeling, materials, and lighting, let's explore the most exciting part, which is the interaction. Before diving into Spline, let's break down the animation to understand it better. Basically, everything happens in 3 steps. The first step is when we press the button. As you can see, when we do that, 3 things happen. The arrow goes to the right, a rising sound plays, and the floor changes from green to red. Also, the light changes from green to red as well. The next step happens when the arrow reaches the right side and we still hold the button. As you can see, now the sound changes to an alarm sound effect and the camera starts shaking, but the floor and arrow stay in the previous state. The final step happens when we release the button. As you can see, when we do that, the arrow goes back to its initial position on the left. While doing that, we hear a new sound effect indicating we release the button and the pressure is reducing. Also, the floor changes back to green and the camera stabilizes as well. Now that we understand what happens in each stage of the interaction, let's go back to Spline and see how all of these actions are structured. Let's start by exploring the press button, where most of the interactivity happens. The button has 2 states, with the second state activated when we press it. In the events section, we have 3 different events. The first one is the mouse press event, which triggers the first step of the animation. Here we have a few actions. The first is for the button itself. When we click it, it transitions from its base state to the second state. Then we have a sound action, which plays the rising sound that we discussed a moment ago. Next, we have the transition for the directional light. In the previous section, we explained that we have 2 different states for the lights, one with a green color and the other with a red color, and pressing the button changes the state of this light. The transition for the floor also happens as we hold the button, changing it from green to red. The same goes for the gauge. where you can see it transitions from its base state to the second state. Finally, we have the arrow, which has two transitions instead of one. The first occurs when we press the button and the arrow reaches the right side of the gauge, and the second happens when we hold the button. We need the second transition to trigger the alarm sound and camera movement, which we will explain in a bit. As you can see, the arrow has three states. One is the initial state where the arrow is on the left, the second state is when the arrow goes to the right, and the third state is for when we hold the button. Next, let's look at the second event, which is the state change event. The state change event allows you to trigger an action based on the state of an object. Here we chose the arrow and set its trigger to when the arrow changes to hold. So now when the arrow reaches the hold state, the second sound plays, which is the alarm sound effect. Next, let's see what happens in the third event, which is the mouse up event. Here, when our mouse is released, three actions occur. The shutdown sound effect plays, and the two other sounds, the alarm and the rising sound, stop. That's basically it for the press button. We also have camera shake. Here we use the state change event again. The principle is the same. When the arrow reaches the hold state, the camera will transition between these three camera states. If you look at the camera states, you can see that the position of the camera changes slightly for each one. In the transition section, you reduce the transition time and add an infinite loop to create a back and forth movement. In the second event, when we release the button and the arrow goes back to its second state, the camera returns to its original position as well. And that's the whole idea of this scene. The principle is simple, but the setup might be a bit complex, so I encourage you to remix this file and play with it to better understand what's going on. With that being said, you've reached the end of this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know if you like this type of tutorial, where I break down the project into parts and explain it to you. Also, let me know if you have any questions or requests for future tutorials. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe and like buttons. Thanks for watching, and take care.